Welcome to She Slays. Our topic today is why diverse teams drive better outcomes. My name is Bani Chandrasena and I'm representing Diversity Collective Lanka. I have a great panel today. Let me introduce the panel. We have Sarah Twigg. Sarah is a gender employment and private sector specialist with the International Finance Corporation, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. Sarah leads the IFC's Women in Work Sri Lanka partnership with the Government of Australia. We have Aroshi Nanayakkara, President of the Rotary Club Colombo and Director on the board of Sampath Bank. She's also the Chair of the Women Directors Forum. We have Kshanika Ratnayake, Founder, Director, CEO of Great Place to Work Sri Lanka, part of a truly diverse and global network across 90 regions on a mission to build a better world by helping every place become a great place to work, focusing on the inclusive factor. Thank you all for joining. Let's get straight to the topic. Let me start with Sarah. Could we talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion, the two terms, and what the differences are?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a great idea because these terms are used so frequently and interchangeably, and people don't often stop to think about what do we actually mean by diversity and what do we mean by inclusion. And they do mean quite different things. So if we think about diversity as being the what and inclusion as being the how. So really diversity in the workplace context is about your workforce composition. It's about who is in your workforce. So thinking about demographics, things like gender, things like disability, sexual orientation, age, ethnicity, religion. All of the aspects that make up individuals are what can bring diversity to the workforce. And really what companies should be aiming to do is to have a workforce that's diverse and that reflects the community in which it serves and which it operates. On the other side, inclusion, which is the how, is really about the measure of how well a work environment or a culture enables all of those diverse individuals to participate and to thrive. So really it's about things like who's at the table, whose voices are being heard. It's really ensuring that all employees, all customers are respected, are empowered, and regardless of their differences. And I think one of the things that's interesting to think about is that you can have diversity without inclusion. So what we sometimes see is that a business may have a diverse range of employees, but if there's not a supportive environment, then those who are outside the norm, let's say, don't feel accepted. They're not empowered to be able to work to their fullest. And if we think about maybe a couple of examples, you could have a workforce that maybe has a 50-50 split of women and men. But if all of the women are in lower skilled, lower paid positions, and all of the men are the ones who are making the decisions and have the leadership voice, you have diversity from a gender perspective, but you don't have inclusion.
Great, thank you for that. Let's move it into maybe one particular area, Aroshi. Would you like to talk a little bit about age? I know that's an area that we don't necessarily talk a lot about, but I think very relevant. If you could talk a little bit about it and some of the experiences you've had.
So Bani, I think this inclusivity or diversity per se has been focused on primarily on gender in the past so many years that we've been having this discussion. So I think some of the other areas that really need to come in is age. And do your boards now, I'm on the Sri Lanka Institute of Directors, I'm the Senior Vice Chair, and we are looking at, in terms of corporate governance, what is the spectrum you're looking at in bringing onto your board? How many women are you including? Are there different ethnicities represented? And age, I think, is a critical factor because increasingly we have, particularly in Sri Lanka, we have boards with primarily male, 55 to 65, 70-year-old males very mature, sitting on boards. And that younger generation and their aspirations, what are the products that they are out there looking for? What can you really offer them as a customer base? That whole conversation gets a little lost because you're not ready to change with the times. So I'm more focusing on the on the senior leadership at the board level, how do we make a mark there to make sure that you're including younger people, male or female, to bring in a completely different perspective onto your decision making at board level, let's say, or at senior management level. So there are highly educated, competent people who passed out from some of the topmost universities in the world. Plus, you've got very capable local universities, producing great people who get snapped up in international markets, but we are not really, picking that up, because we've got all kinds of little quirks that are hang-ups that are preventing us from really identifying that requirement and making it a more diverse platform at board level or at senior management level. So
I think that exemplifies this whole thinking outside the box, which is exactly what it is. Just one quote that comes to mind: Diversity Matters McKinsey 2015 talked about the positive relationship between financial performance and greater diversity in leadership. And I think that's exactly what you're focusing on. Kshanika, if we can maybe talk a little bit about, so diversity inclusion we're clear on. There is equity that we always hear with it. If you could unpack that a little.
That's right, because typically what happens is, you could have a diverse environment in which you have rolled out inclusive initiatives or activities. But however, the missing link or the real connect is to make sure that there is equity in the sense that you need to ensure that people have access to the same possibilities, everybody, because we also have to understand that there are obstacles and barriers when you have people of different background and you bring in different talent to a workforce. Right? So when that happens, the starting point for everybody is not the same. And that's a primary reason you're bringing in different talent to the organization, right? So how do you make it equitable? It's not about making it equal, but do we have systems that you help other people? Some need some additional support, others need a leg up. Some are very good in a particular space. For example, we have somebody who's on the spectrum, right? Extremely creative and very good at what he or she does actually in her space. But however, she's awful at communication, right? And so there is a huge gap or barrier that someone, a leader or another team member, has to actually bridge the gap between how she interacts with the rest of the team. Otherwise, it could end up by her feeling isolated or not being able to actually be accepted into the team, and therefore you won't get the desired impact of creating a diverse and inclusive environment. So you have to create that equity, that balance. Understand that there are differences. The primary reason there's diversity is because it's different, right? And then you have to put in mechanisms in the organization by which we ensure that there is equity and you give the support required depending on that starting point. Just like a good example is, for example, in golf, we know the better ranked players need to do the same course in a less number of shots, right? They have they need to do it on a lower path, right? In order to win a round, right? Because they are already better at the game, and other people are playing catch up, right? So there is a sense of playing catch up, but there's a valid reason to have people who are playing catch up. We don't want people on a team because you just want to create diversity. It should never be the reason, right? But you have them there to bring in those differences that a team needs, and you create that diverse environment, and then you have to make sure you have those equity measures in place to ensure that you support them to get the desired outcome of creating diverse teams.
So I think what you're also saying is diversity is needed so that we can get the best out. But with diversity means different capabilities, abilities are different. So if you want everybody to feel comfortable, get the maximum out to get that overall performance of overall the team, it's being able to be flexible.
Yes.
And I think that is very relevant when it comes to policies, things like that in
Correct.
company.
Bani, may I just add that stereotyping and unconscious bias are two things that, as human beings, those are our go-to reactions. It happens automatically kind of thing. But I think you have to be, as a leadership team, really be watchful about stereotyping. And I actually did my thesis was on a particular study on how good somebody looks, right? So the same person, we took and made him look nerdy, him and her both actually, and then made him look really good kind of thing. And everybody associated this good-looking guy with being able to perform incredibly well, far better than, so it's just complete stereotyping, and it happens immediately and automatically. So as I think leadership teams, you have to be really watchful that you don't just get caught up in that.
Sure. And the reality, if I may add there, is we all will have unconscious biases.
Absolutely.
That's being human is that.
Absolutely.
But just being able to be more reflective before you make the decision becomes. If we can now move on, Sarah, a little bit, let's talk about why companies should care about diversity and inclusion. What's in it for them to actually take this step?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we've seen study again has demonstrated that there is real value for businesses in actually focusing on greater diversity and inclusion. I mean, if we think about things like talent, which is, a huge issue for businesses in Sri Lanka right now, accessing talent. Focusing on diversity and inclusion not only widens your potential talent pool, because all of a sudden you're opening it up to a broader spectrum of the population, but it also enhances your value proposition as an employer. So you're opening it up to more employees, and then you're actually more attractive as an employer to those employees. We've also seen that it leads to increased revenue, and this is in part because it opens up new markets. So if businesses are thinking about diversity and inclusion not only in terms of their own workforce, but also in terms of potential markets and who they might be serving with their products or services, then it also increases their potential markets. Innovation, I think, is another big area. So we know that diverse teams are more innovative. You're bringing more perspectives to the table. And so, of course, you're going to be able to better problem solve and better innovate. So I think that's one of the really, really key reasons is actually just having that diversity of perspectives. And then finally, I'd reflect on productivity. So we know that productivity improves in businesses where employees feel valued and where they feel supported. And so employee well-being is inherently linked to diversity and inclusion, and particularly the inclusion part of making sure that employees feel supported and feel welcome.
Sure. I think that links really well with the culture, the company culture. Kshanika, if you wanted to share a little bit more about how culture fits into all
Yes.
this.
So it is required to build a culture around that intent of, you can't just have it on the agenda and it won't just happen because you have some metrics and you have some targets that you need to meet in terms of diversity numbers of by age or by gender or differently abled people in your team. You have to first make it inclusive. Yes, you have to bring in the equity component, and then this has to be driven right from the top, right? Anything for it to become culture needs to be driven from top management itself, right? And then it has to be practiced in a consistent manner, regularly, over a long period of time before it becomes culture. It's not something that you decide today and tomorrow you suddenly have, because we're going to make a lot of mistakes. Even us, we, like I said, we have people on the spectrum, we have diversity in age, in gender, in all of these aspects. And some things work and some things don't work, right? So you have to adjust, but it is that willingness to think and to bring all of those aspects in, because when you create that environment, you automatically build a level of trust within that organization, right? And the work we do also as Great Place to Work, our work is also revolving around the fact that we are trying to build great workplaces for all employees, right? The for all is the important part here, because we're saying across all demographic groups, right? So age, gender, tenure, your background, where you come from, what your speciality is, who you know, what you do, all of that, right? We're trying to create an egalitarian environment. You're not judged all the time by, the role you're playing. It's more about how you can build a sense of belonging for the individual, right? So if they feel valued, if they really believe, if you build a culture where people feel that they are valued, they are respected, right? Then they start contributing in amazing ways, right? Ways that you, even as a CEO or a leader whom you may have hired, may not expect this to happen, right? They start contributing, they go the extra mile, there's discretionary effort, right? And they really become an integrated part of that organization. And then now we are talking culture, right? Because it's becoming what you breathe, eat, live day in, day out, right? So that sense of belonging, which comes from creating these trusting bonds within the organization, really is what drives that. And then this becomes, like Sarah said, an incredible EVP for the organization, right? And then you use that to attract more people. You use that to retain your best talent. You use that in a way that you have now been recognized as an organization or as a workplace that has a culture of diversity and inclusion.
That's when you get your productivity and your
That's
business,
right.
Exactly.
business case.
It's not
your
just
top
going to
line.
come in because you have some metric or some target or goal that you have met, and then you're wondering, but where are the numbers? Where are the results? Right? It is about all living that promise and what you are looking to do.
And I don't think it's a straight journey.
No, it's not, and it doesn't
pivots,
happen overnight
changes.
as well, right? So culture takes it's a constant fluid state, right?
Aroshi, if I may bring in a little bit about support structures, if we are going to talk about gender as an example, talk us through a little bit about your advice to women and what kind of support structure they should be creating for themselves so that they are in it for the long haul.
So Bani, as I think we discussed earlier, or it's been out there in many fora, a lot of Sri Lankan women are qualifying. There are more women qualifying from university, from CIMA to everything else than actually men. One thing that really holds them back is that you don't have that support structure. I was in this commission, Human Resource Development Commission, a few years back, and we were doing these studies to understand what is holding women back. And a couple of the things were transport. They did not have security in traveling, right? So you have companies like the apparel industry, the entire industry, if you take, you have transport, buses, vans, to whatever, which are transporting 60,000 employees up and down on a daily basis, right? So you as an organization have to create, and it goes back to the culture also that Kshanika was talking about. How do you create that culture and that engagement with your employees? So the productivity levels are completely different from the rest of the Sri Lankan enterprises you have. So the apparel industry is one of the, it's doing brilliantly even within this COVID period, right? Because the support structures that are required are really being put in there. They have creches in each of the factories, in the offices. And from a woman's perspective, I think we can't always, so if we are not in the apparel industry or in the IT industry, we can't say, oh my gosh, I don't have a support structure, what do I do, right? You also have a duty, you're qualifying out of university on taxpayers' money, I might add. It's free education unlike anywhere else in the world, right? You have a duty to take yourself further, right? So that aspiration to be something, I think, has to be drilled into the women themselves. And once you figure that out, you will figure out what are the support structures you need and how do I get them sorted out, right? It might be your parents. Now for me, my parents were there, the entire childcare part of it was taken care of, right? I do a lot of coaching, particularly for the banking sector. Hundreds of women that I have coached, and some of them were willing to give up multinational bank jobs because they had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning or whatever to make 3 different types of food for their kids and the husband and for themselves. And I was just like, pay whatever the amount, small amount you have to pay and get a maid. Why would you give up a job just for something like this, right? So I think we also as women shouldn't be giving up so easily. We need to figure out what is it that's required and how do we, look at a slightly broader picture and go out of the box and figure out what is it that we need to do and get that done. So in terms of the employer and individually both ways, I think it has to really kick in.
I'd just add to that, I think one of the things that COVID has been helping is getting employers to shift their perspectives on what it means to have a full-time job or a permanent job. I mean, gone are the days where you have to be in the office at 8 a.m. and you've got to be there all day until 5:30 and then you catch your bus home. I mean, it's, some businesses have gone back to that model, but the majority of businesses have recognized, okay, A, that doesn't actually work for our employees. B, it's actually not necessary in terms of delivering on our objectives and delivering on our business. So I think one of the things that we expect and we hope will be a real boon for women coming into the workforce is they will have greater opportunities to say, I need this kind of flexibility. I do have responsibilities, and men also have responsibilities. And the more that men take on some of those shared responsibilities like household responsibilities and child rearing, it becomes a shared responsibility, and then both women and men can go in and start asking and demanding this kind of flexibility. So I think we're seeing it shift. It may still be incremental. In some industries, I mean, the IT industry for sure has been a real leader in this in Sri Lanka, and they've really pushed the envelope in terms of creating these kind of environments. But definitely there's a lot of responsibility on employers to be thinking about employment differently.
I guess one way I would put that is like the employer has that responsibility, the family has the responsibility. Yes. It's not a woman's role or a man's role. And also employees are requesting some of these equity related requirements instead of always expecting the company to be able to figure it out or read your mind. Like to go ask.
Yes.
Suggest. Great. So I think we've kind of covered diversity, inclusion, equity. We've also covered a lot about the roles employee would play, the role individually, part of a partnership. I think all of those bits are important. I'd like to touch on what you started on before, which was about the access to markets. And when we talk about diversity, the different aspects of diversity and how much we're leaving on the table, companies are leaving on the table. Care to share a little bit more on that?
And thanks, Bani. I mean, I think so often when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we only think about it internally. And we often forget about this aspect of these are diverse markets that all of our businesses are serving. And I'll give you just a couple of numbers to think about. So Sri Lanka has more than 1.7 million people who live with a disability. That's a huge market, right? There's an estimated close to 6% of the population are LGBTQI. There was a recent study in Sri Lanka which estimates that actually in Sri Lanka it might be as many as 1.5 million.
It's much higher.
So 1.5 million people who are LGBTQI in Sri Lanka. So at the global level, there's been some studies which show that for people with disabilities, there's a close to $2 trillion in annual disposable income that community has to spend. And then if you add on all of their friends and families who are also going to spend money to support them, it comes to more like $3.5 billion. So we are talking about huge market segments. And, to effectively reach those markets, obviously it's incredibly helpful to have a diverse workforce, a workforce that actually reflects the markets that you're trying to serve. Because it's really about designing and delivering products that actually meet the needs of those consumers. And so there's a couple of really great company examples that I wanted to just reflect on. So HSBC, obviously a huge global brand, they have made a push to become the bank of choice for disabled customers and the employer of choice for disabled employees. And so what they have done is they have launched a disability smart banking solution platform, basically. So all of their solutions will be accessible to people who are deaf, to people who are blind, to people with, who have other motor neuron, disabilities. And so they've been really working on developing customer-facing products that actually serve that market. And then closer to home, in the apparel sector, the adaptive clothing market, again, a huge market, and something which Sri Lanka has the opportunity to tap into in a really big way.
Yeah.
And we're already seeing some of the garment manufacturers such as MAS who are very active in this market. And it was great to see 2 years ago, I think it was, that MAS actually partnered with the National Paralympic Committee to design and make all of the clothing for their athletes.
Yeah.
And so this is clothing that is, using different types of fasteners so that people who are differently able can actually, get dressed themselves. So when we think about it at that level, it's not rocket science. It's just giving people the products and services that they can use and that enable them to live their life to the fullest. And as a business, that's just smart business.
Exactly. And if I can just add to that, in order to serve those markets effectively, to be innovative, to be able to address the needs in a way that it actually makes sense for the people who are using it, then you need to have employees on your teams, the workforce, right?
Who can understand.
You can design those
only
products.
Somebody who has that disability can really design something or understand how difficult it might be to get into a particular, or just enter the premises if you don't have disability access. Right. So, these are primarily the reasons why. HSBC has disability access to the bank, right, to start with, I just said. I'm sure several others do as well. But if you don't, it's like saying if you don't get your act together at home, then you can't get out there. And it's the basics, right? So you need to have those people on your team to be able to, you have to mirror society in order to be able to address the needs of society, and then that customer centricity comes, because then you can actually build products that are actually needed by the people who actually understand them the most.
Yeah, so that's a great point about mirroring society, and how do we actually measure it and hold ourselves or companies accountable. I know sometimes measurement dashboards tend to kind of get carried away. But I'm putting it on the table as to what would be some of the basic measures, easy measures companies can start with so that they can hold themselves accountable, because we all know what gets measured gets done.
Yeah.
Well, and I would say, on the employee side, the first thing to do is to actually understand who's in your workforce. So, collect some of that demographic data, start to ask questions, and they can be anonymous, but to start to identify what proportion of your workforce has a disability, what proportion of your workforce identifies as LGBTQI, what proportion of your workforce, start to actually get some data. So then you can identify, okay, now that we know who's in our workforce and how diverse we are, maybe we can identify a couple of areas where we really need to focus on bringing in more diversity. So I would say that's a great first place to start.
Yeah.
By no means the end, but it's a good starting point.
Probably another thing is to measure what kind of experience they're having in the organization, right? Because that whole inclusivity will come saying, okay, we may have diversity in the organization, but are we including them in the fabric? Is the social fabric of our organization becoming something, that they are contributing to, that there's egalitarian treatment, that they're all getting the opportunities to whether it's develop or be promoted or do the projects or really shine in the environments, or are they being held back? Right? So that's another measure that's important to understand what they're experiencing and whether they have the opportunities as well.
And also, Bani, in terms of technology, today's technology is there to support, the data mining that is required to find out those data points. The technology is also available to produce goods if required, right? On a smaller scale. Now the Ford T model, where everything had to be that black Ford car which is coming out of the production line, is no longer valid, and our society to a certain extent is narcissistic enough to demand, I want my underwear branded with my name on it or whatever, right? And you need to be able to cater to that as an organization. So understanding your workforce and understanding your customers, and definitely providing that leadership that is required at the topmost level, I think is very important.
I think that's the other valid point, or the point that I wanted to bring, which is when you're measuring diversity in numbers, percentages, measuring it in leadership is just as important, because we tend to go the easy route of measuring as a whole.
Correct.
But you do need role models. You do need young generation to aspire and see themselves in the senior leaders. If I may bring up one other topic, and I've heard this plenty of times, I think you all have had it too. When it comes to recruitment, we all hear this thing about recruiting on merit. Can we unpack a little bit about what this merit actually means, and how unconscious bias kind of gets in the way of merit if we're not careful?
Yeah, maybe I'll kick off with just a reflection on a Harvard business study that was done a couple of years ago, where they actually analysed companies that this was in the space of promotions, companies whose promotion criteria was merit-based versus companies who had kind of specific criteria for promotions. They consistently promoted more men than women, even when women had exactly the same scorecards, etc. So this idea of merit being the kind of the be all and end all can actually hide and and enable unconscious bias to actually be much more prevalent.
May I
Sure.
just add, in terms of, say, a performance appraisal, I'm in the HR space, we're looking at appraisals which were done 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and you go and look at those KPIs and see whether anything has changed. It hasn't, right? So you now need to start thinking about who's all of our, if you take bottom line wise, what is making impact? Your relationship with your customers, let's say, is that in your KPI sheet, right? CRM, customer relationship management. Have you pushed it from a 3 to a 5 in the past financial year? Nobody's measuring that because you right? So now if your relationship is that good, you will be looking at the profitability hitting your P&L in the next year or the year after, right? Because this is a long-term journey with your relationship with your customer. So those metrics need to start changing, and they've been stacked a little bit in the older generations, older models, and we really need to start thinking of that and looking at what is relevant today.
Yeah, I think it needs to move a little bit also to the model of continuous assessment, as opposed to taking at a point in time, a end of year or half year or quarterly, because most KPIs, as Aroshi also said, will be around hard numbers, right? And then there are a lot of softer areas that if you haven't defined your scorecards well, or your KPI or measurements well, right, that do not get captured. And the reality is, in most organizations, the women are in the softer skilled jobs, right? So you may not actually see that, let's say, for example, a secretary who's getting you all those meetings or getting you all those connect calls for the customer relationship manager, right? Who then says, oh, I had this many calls with my clients, and I have this number of connects, and my relationship management is excellent. But it may be actually somebody else who has that rapport with that gentleman or lady secretary or someone else to even get through the door to a meeting or to get into that conversation. Now, does that get measured? And who gets the credit? Who is then merited for that success? So the softer skills or the lower levels, the SSUs, the support units, right, where their contribution is not measured in the same way, may not get the same amount of focus in a meritocracy only system. Meritocracy is not a bad thing. We need to have people, we need to make decisions based on merit, but it's not the only method that we should be.
I think defining that merit is the most important thing.
Yeah. Correct.
Yeah. But it also goes back to Kshanika's earlier points about equity, and that sometimes, as Aroshi was saying, that merit has been defined by, a traditional worldview, and it doesn't factor in the fact that, as people are bringing in these different skills, and so that's where sometimes this equity question also comes in. that sometimes merit is not the only decision on which
Yeah,
to make.
that's right.
You know, merit has to be there, but there are other factors that also need to be considered if we really want to build these diverse workforces.
I think one of the, if I may, one of the other notions or maybe myths is that everything needs to be equal, right? And everything will never be equal.
And it's not equal.
It's not equal either, right? So these inequalities are there, which is why you need the equity also. Some people need the step up, some people need support, some people, because they're bringing something else that someone else cannot bring to the agenda, right? Or to the workforce in this case, right? So then we have to have different ways of recognizing and bringing merit to those people as well.
I think that's a really valid point, and I think the way I'd like to put it here is when we talk about leadership and development, I think if you think of it from a few years ago, it is very much about being in charge, being in control. Those were kinds of the terms that we used for leadership.
The alpha male.
Exactly. And realistically, what you hear about leadership now is that it's messy. Yeah. There is no straight way to do it, and it will get messy, and that's part of it. And that's where the authenticity comes. Yeah. That's where the belonging comes. That's where the trust comes. Because if you see the boss being able to make a mistake and apologize, there's so much more trust and a rapport that is built. And then you kind of have the kind of cohesion, the collaboration that is required. And those, I think, are the outcomes we're talking about when it comes to diverse teams. And even when you think of a family and a family that has somebody with disability, the characteristics that come out in people, the kindness, all of those aspects, I think, come out in company cultures as well. And that is where the real magic or gold sits. Correct. Which I think sometimes, like you very rightly said, we're so busy measuring the obvious that
you miss them.
That you miss out on the finer points, and that's kind of where that competitive advantage, the new things that we're all working on, the customization that you spoke about.
And unfortunately, it's most often the disadvantaged in one form or the other. I mean, it could be women, it could be aged population, it could be people with disabilities, or whatever, makes them disadvantaged, right? It could be that they are working single mothers or, traveling from distance. Unfortunately, they are the ones who get caught up in that vicious web of they're not able to come to the surface or come to the top in terms of an entirely 100% meritocracy-based system by itself.
And it's those very disadvantages become access to marketplaces in providing special features on your products, on your services. So if you have this vanilla, all same, all similar looking product force, that's all that they can create on the other side. So if I were to try and summarize everything we spoke about today, diversity is important. Diversity is reality. Diversity is what we live and breathe every day. But how we actually make that a reality in the workforces, in the community, takes a bit of effort, takes a bit of reflection. And in order to be able to do that, companies do have to take a step forward towards being aware and taking that as a priority in how they build cultures. And when it comes to building cultures, it's not just the soft things, it is the hard points like measuring, keeping yourself accountable. And there are lots of different ways. We're seeing it all over the world. We're beginning to see it in Sri Lanka, which is taking a slow toll in, but I think conversations like this are really important to actually get it to the forefront and to make it mainstream. While gender is one of the topics that we are sort of celebrating this month and are in the front and center most of the time, diversity is not just about gender. There is so many different angles because all of us are different. I mean, the four of us, might be women, but we're very, very different. And I think sometimes we forget about that when we're talking about strategy and game plans, etc. So I think Are there any other points you all would like to bring up? Or I think we've kind of covered what we think we want to cover. In other words, why diverse teams drive better outcomes, I think, is not just one answer. It's many. And there are many ways to look at it. There are many ways to go about it. But it starts with being aware and holding ourselves accountable.
If there's one thing maybe I can add, I think the new generation that's coming into the workforce, I mean, not Generation Y is very well embedded in the workforce, there's Generation Z coming into the workforce, and they passionately want to see more diversity. They have no tolerance for lack of diversity, right? Because they are also very, very different individuals. The way they work, their aspirations, the way they see the world, right? So they are, the younger generation is more likely, I mean, there are statistics, of course, they say 67% of them are more likely to join an organization or a workforce that shows diversity, right? And then 72% are likely to leave an organization for a more inclusive environment, right? So there are lots of statistics like that tell us it's a very good reason for organizations to actually understand why they need to invest in this, and really, they're already too late, right? This really has to be something that we're doing day in, day out today.
Yep. I'll take that as a final comment, and thank you all for joining this wonderful discussion, and hope to see more of this and see all of you all more with conversations like this in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bani. Thank you.